Welcome to World Talk Brief. On February 28, 2026, the Middle East was suddenly thrown into a new, totally unpredictable conflict. It was a day that started with the sound of sirens and ended with the death of a nation's leader. And then came this stunning announcement from President Donald Trump himself. He confirmed that the United States, working with Israel, had just launched a massive military campaign against Iran. It was a move that would literally reshape the region in just a matter of hours. So the big question is, how did we get here, right? How does a super complex nuclear deal and all these diplomatic chess moves just completely fall apart and end in an all-out war? Well, let's trace that path, step by step, from the negotiating table right to the battlefield. Okay, so to really get this, our story doesn't actually start on the battlefield. It starts in the halls of the United Nations back in late 2025. This is where the diplomatic road to war was paved, all thanks to a powerful and pretty controversial tool that was buried deep inside the original Iran nuclear deal. It all comes down to this thing called the snapback mechanism. Now, this was a really crucial part of that 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA. What it did was allow any of the countries who signed it to unilaterally trigger the return of all the old UN sanctions if they thought Iran was breaking the rules. And here's the key part. The whole process was automatic, and it couldn't be vetoed by countries like Russia or China. And in late 2025, that's exactly what went down. On August 28th, the three big European powers in the deal, that's France, Germany, and the UK, they notified the UN they were pulling the trigger. Russia and China, well, they tried to stop it. They drafted a resolution to keep the sanctions off, but it failed on September 26th. So, just 3 days later, it was a done deal. The snapback was official, and all those old, crippling UN sanctions were suddenly back on Iran. And, here's where it gets kind of ironic. Russia, of all countries, was the one that actually came up with the snapback idea back in 2015. They saw it as this really clever, veto-proof way to make sure the deal was enforced. But fast forward 10 years, and they're calling the very same mechanism legally flawed. I mean, the original agreement was just completely shattered. So what did all this actually do? Well, the consequences were huge, and they happened fast. Instead of forcing Iran back to the negotiating table, the snapback did the exact opposite. It pushed Tehran even deeper into an alliance with Moscow, it sped up their look east policy towards China, and it just confirmed what Iranian leaders already believed, that the West could not be trusted. You can see their point of view. Why bother making deals if the other side is just going to break them anyway? So as that diplomatic path just completely fell apart, the military path started heating up. Once the calendar flipped from 2025 to 2026, all the talk about sanctions got replaced by the sound of warships and warplanes moving into position. And it wasn't just talk. In late January, the U.S. started moving a massive amount of military power into the region. I mean, we're talking the biggest military buildup we'd seen there since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. This wasn't just sending a message, this was a clear sign that a major military operation was definitely on the table. February then turned into this really tense split-screen situation. On one hand, you had these last-ditch diplomatic talks starting up in Geneva. But on the other hand, Iran was flexing its military muscle, temporarily closing the Strait of Hormuz, a massive choke point for global oil. Just a couple of days before the attack, its Revolutionary Guard was practicing missile strikes on a major airbase used by the U.S. And then on February 27th, the talks failed for the last time. The path to war was now wide open. And that brings us to February 28th. As the sun came up over the Middle East, this massive joint military campaign was unleashed. And let me tell you, this was a complex, multi-layered attack with some really big goals. Of course, everyone involved had a code name for their part in the fight. The U.S. called it Operation Epic Fury. Israel's was Shagat Ha'ari, which means roaring lion. And Iran's retaliation? That was going to be called Operation True Promise 4. And when you look at the stated goals from the U.S. and Israel, they were incredibly ambitious. This was not just some limited strike. They wanted to tear down Iran's entire nuclear and missile programs, wipe out its navy, cut off its support for proxies around the region, and, as President Trump made very clear, achieve the ultimate goal, regime change. To give you an idea of the scale here, in the very first wave of the attack, more than 200 Israeli fighter jets hit targets across Iran all at the same time. This was a show of force designed to completely overwhelm and paralyze the country's defenses from the very start. And what were they hitting? Well, those jets struck something like 500 different targets in that first wave alone. We're talking mostly missile launchers and air defense systems. The idea was to cripple Iran's ability to fight back before it could even get started. And this wasn't just an air attack. It came from land, sea, and air. You had U.S. ships firing Tomahawk cruise missiles, while forces on the ground used advanced rocket systems. And they used this new tactic with swarms of cheap drones, sending them in first to basically confuse and swamp Iran's air defense radar to clear a path for the main strikes. But the single most important thing that happened that day, it wasn't blowing up a missile silo or sinking a ship. It was a decapitation strike, aimed right at the very top of the Iranian regime. What happened next was just a whole day of chaos and conflicting reports. First, you get rumors from Israeli media that the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed. Then, Iranian state media comes out and furiously denies it. Then, President Trump gets in front of the press and basically says, yeah, we think that's true. The next morning, the truth finally trickled out. First, a confirmation that members of his family were killed, and then the official announcement. After 37 years in power, the 86-year-old supreme leader was dead. But here's the thing. Does killing the leader automatically kill the regime? Well, not so fast. The Council on Foreign Relations pointed out that the Islamic Republic is an entire system, an ideology with very deep roots. Their take was that the theocracy itself would probably survive. Sure, it'd be battered and bruised, but it would still be standing. So while the regime was reeling, its next move, its retaliation, would turn out to be a massive, catastrophic mistake. One that created a whole new reality in the Middle East. So Iran hit back with Operation True Promise 4. It was a huge barrage of ballistic missiles. But here's the critical part. They didn't just aim at Israel or U.S. forces. They fired on targets all across the Persian Gulf, striking Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE. And right there, that's where everything flipped. For decades, Iran had built what it called its axis of resistance, this network of proxies designed to challenge the U.S. and Israel. Well, in a single night, its own missiles created the total opposite. A new axis of isolation. It had accidentally forged a coalition of its greatest enemies against itself. This was a fundamental realignment of the entire region. Those Iranian missiles completely blew up that fragile peace deal that was forming between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Instead of staying on the sidelines, the Saudis condemned Tehran and actually offered military support to the coalition. The UAE had a civilian killed, so they reserved the right to escalate. The result was amazing, really. For the very first time, you had the Gulf Arab states, the US, and Israel all on the same side, united against Iran. Which brings us to the final huge question hanging over all of this. The attack took out the leader and redrew the map of the entire region. But the power vacuum that's now growing in Tehran, is that going to lead to freedom, like President Trump hoped? Or is it about to unleash a new conflict, one that's even more dangerous and chaotic than before? That is the dangerously unanswered question.